So we've got 14 iconic legends that makes the world what it is today. Culturally, I guess we could say. We're not talking about industrialists or great inventors and discoverers and that kind of thing. So I'm going to start this. There's 14 of these guys. This is all men. Not saying there are not important women. That's a separate story and one which I'm kind of working on. So these are all men. And this is about the modern age, the modern world we live in, or the postmodern world we live in, let's say the 20th, 21st century. And I'm going to start off, this is all in order of birth, not in order of importance, but kind of in a way, because as we go from each person's birth to the next person's birth, we move forward in time, obviously, and get closer and closer to our own time and people living now. So I'm going to start with Lord Byron. Lord Byron was born in 1788 and is known as a romantic poet. Now there's many other romantic poets I could have chosen, but look at this picture of him. This is a very iconic picture, and it's pointing towards the future, I think. Here he is, a great traveller, a great poet and a great warrior, a man who's breaking all sorts of conventions. Oh, he's doing it all. I mean, there's incest, there's sort of underage. We don't know if that really happened or not. He's homosexual and he's not homosexual, and he's attacks authority, although he is a lord, so he has a position in the House of Lords, but he's basically driven out of England and he's looking for causes, and he ends up going to Greece and fighting in their civil war for their freedom, I think from the Austrians, I don't know, from someone, and he ends up dying there. And I think if music had been around, he would have been a great pop star. I don't mean one of those lackluster surface only pop stars. I mean a great sort of figure in the world, a great musical genius, a great lyricist and a great performer. But poetry in those days was the rock and roll of its day in many ways, and what the Romantics represented has come right through that kind of genre to us today. So that's Lord Byron, number 14 on my list. So, number 13, Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was born in 1854. I'm sure everybody's heard of the picture of Dorian Gray. I used to have the Selfish Giant book for my kids. It was a brilliant book. So here you have this great wit, this great poet, this great writer. And one of the things I'm looking for in this list, one of the reasons that many people didn't get on this list, although they're very important and legends themselves, is vulnerability. What I'm trying to do is put something together where you've got this force of nature, this passion, this drive, this strength, but it's coupled with this vulnerability. What else could I call it? This vulnerable side, this edge they have, that these characters that really shows their weakness in a way. And I think Oscar Wilde has that. He's all well and good and big, and as you can see by the quotes, he's so funny, he's so cutting, he's so articulate, he's got it all, but what happens? He ends up being absolutely disgraced in a homosexual affair, and ends up doing time in prison, hard labour I think it was, and then his kind of career's destroyed and he goes off to Paris, and then he ends up dying. Some people say he died of syphilis, but it seems that he got an infection, ear infection, that turned into meningitis. We don't know, but it was a kind of sad end to a glorious start. So that's Oscar Wilde, number 13. Number 12, T.E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, born 1888. I mean, what an incredible man. He was a poet himself, but what he did go into Arabia, if you've seen the film Lawrence of Arabia, one of the greatest films ever, and Peter O'Toole is absolutely outstanding as T.E. Lawrence. And what he did by going native there and managing to get in with the Arab peoples, the Bedouins, and led them into their own liberation, and kind of adopted their dress. Look at the picture of him. It's such a romantic ideal, isn't it? Even though it seems to have sent him a bit crackers. And what happens to him? He ends up back in England and driving fast motorbikes through the countryside, I guess looking for the thrill that he had once had in the desert and in the war, and ends up crashing his bike. They've still got his bike somewhere. And here is a heroic figure that's also, I don't know if it's true, there's rumours that he was homosexual or bisexual, and he was very different to the ordinary person, and he certainly was a warrior, wasn't he? He was certainly a poet, and he was certainly a warrior. And where's the vulnerable side? I've seen it in the movie. In the movie, there is a great vulnerability to this man. He has this intensity, but he also has this kind of soft side, I don't know if we could call it a feminine side. Dare we call it a feminine side with these characters where they're so kind of macho on the one hand, and on the other hand they're so kind of feminine. But that's T.E. Lawrence, number 12. Number 11, Robert Johnson, born, we think, 1911, the great itinerant roving blues player. I don't know an awful lot about Robert Johnson. I listened to his stuff a long time ago now, but it's kind of stayed in my mind. And when you listen to people like Eric Clapton and Keith Richards and people like that who have really made something in the rock world, they really pay a lot of homage to this man. He roved from town to town. He was great on the guitar, but people say that he originally wasn't a very good guitar player, and so you get these legends of selling your soul to the devil at the crossroads, where in return for being able to play brilliantly you sell your soul. No one knows if this really happened or to Robert Johnson. There's stories it happened to other people, and then the story was put on Robert Johnson. I don't know. Was he vulnerable? I don't know. People say he was quite an educated guy, even coming from where he came from and in those days. I don't know. People say that he was a decent man, but he really sort of liked his women, and they say he had a woman in every town that he visited, and in the end people say he was poisoned by a jealous husband. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but in his music, blues, I'm not a big blues fan, but I do appreciate it. It is something that our modern music really comes out of. It was so influential, blues. And it is the music, someone once said, of what you don't have rather than what you do have, which is the way maybe things are a bit like that now. And so I don't know his true character, but I see in him a strength and a vulnerability that goes through time. So that's number 11, Robert Johnson. Number 10, my old friend, not real friend obviously, of my old favourite, who we used to call Jack the Dripper in art school. That's Jackson Pollock. Now, of course, Jackson Pollock, born 1912. Now, He's famous for his drip paintings. They still seem to be controversial, whereas someone like Picasso or even Andy Warhol seem to be quite acceptable these days. To a lot of people, Jackson Pollock's work is just a pile of rubbish. It's just trash. Anyone can do it. A monkey can do it. It's don't say anything. I loved it. One of his sayings when someone asked him something like, "Why don't you paint from nature?" He looked at him and said, "I am nature." And I think I think that kind of action painting, the painting on the floor and the movement that he was creating, it's very musical and very alive, I think. I love those paintings. Other people say that his work was funded by the CIA and all that stuff. Who knows if that's true? Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Maybe he was fortunate. Maybe someone else did it a little bit before him. I think there was a woman, I can't remember their name, but he was a force of nature. Now, I love this picture of him. You can see this picture. This picture's so iconic, and it's really pointing at, I mean, if we look at the cover of the Skinhead book later on, which I think really influenced the punk movement, and look at a band like The Clash, look this kind of pose. Andy Warhol, for example, was so vacuous. I kind of like Warhol, but he's so surface. He's got nothing to say, and he's so vacuous, where Jackson Pollock was the opposite. He was full of stuff to say, and well, I don't know about to say, because he's saying it in his work. Dies in a car crash, likes a drink. Yeah, he's a bit macho, but you know, why the hell not? Was he vulnerable? Was he vulnerable? That's a criteria for this, and it's hovering for me. I didn't know the guy, but I see vulnerability in that face. And oh, chicken. Yeah, the chickens are around and the motorbikes are around, and I'm contending with that. But anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Number 10, Jackson Pollock. Number 9, Jack Kerouac. Now, I only know bits and pieces of Jack Kerouac. Again, look at these pictures. He's a big drinker, and he's a big smoker, and you know, he's a bit of a man's man, and he's breaking all the conventions, and he's writing these great books that are kind of like On the Road, where he's kicking off a whole thing that goes into the subculture of the beat generation and the beatniks and all that stuff, and then on through the hippies and the 60s and the 70s and all that. And he's a very influential guy in that. And is he vulnerable? He's definitely a poet warrior. Is he vulnerable? That's the question. He seems to me like he is, that he's not. You know, a lot of these stars, a lot of these real big icons are a bit like, they're full of hubris, you know, they're very full of themselves, they're very certain of things, and I figure he's not so certain. He was a very spiritual kind of guy, Jack Kerouac. I don't think he ever gave up his faith in Catholicism, and was always sort of asking for forgiveness and stuff for what he was doing. So I think there is a vulnerability there. Anyway, find out for yourselves. Number 9, Jack Kerouac. Number 8, Marlon Brando, born 1924. Well, was Marlon Brando the greatest movie actor ever? It don't seem that he cared very much one way or the other. It was just something he did. The vulnerability. I mean, it really gets me every time. He's so strong. He's so macho. He's such a man's man. He's so handsome. But he's just so vulnerable, isn't he? He really shows that vulnerability. He's not afraid of it. Out of all the people on this list, he's probably the one that is the least afraid to let it go and show his inner emotions. Absolutely brilliant actor. I'm not going to go over all his films, but I've seen a good many of them, and he was absolutely fantastic actor, and a true poet warrior. And he really didn't seem to care about the business of acting and all the showcasing and all the razzmatazz. He didn't seem to have that in him at all. It was a job for him, but if that was just a job, imagine what he would be like if he did something he actually really liked. Like, how could you have a plumber like Marlon Brando coming round to your house to fix the washing machine? I mean, you'd be all over the place, wouldn't you? God, blimey. Anyway, that's number 8, Marlon Brando. Number 7, James Dean, born 1931. Hot on the heels of Marlon Brando. In some people say that Marlon Brando and James Dean had an affair, but I think Marlon Brando accused James Dean of being too much like him, copying his style and stuff. And there may be a lot of truth in that. I heard someone say James Dean used to idolise Marlon Brando. But here you really get the sort of teenage pin-up, don't you, for the first time. You really get a guy, you got Brando on a motorbike, but that picture of James Dean on a motorbike and other pictures of James Dean, he's full of alienated, God, what could you call it? I keep calling it vulnerability. It's just there in his face, isn't it? The sadness, the melancholy, what he's expressing through his body, through his looks. Just an amazing actor, and died in a car crash, and maybe never really became what he could become. I think his last film might have been Giant, and he really ages in that from a young person right up to being an old man. It's well worth seeing. I think Elizabeth Taylor, maybe Rock Hudson are in it. Story of a kind of oil tycoon family's rise. Absolutely amazing, James Dean, and really set the stage. I think more Brando and James Dean really set the stage for rock and roll to appear. Elvis could have made this list, but I just don't see that kind of vulnerability in him, although he probably was, because we all are. But I don't really see it. I don't see the poet. Yeah, he sang great songs. He was absolutely brilliant, singer and performer. Of course he was, but I don't see that inner turmoil in him. Not as far as he's expressing it in his art. Anyway, that's number 7, James Dean. Number 6, Che Guevara, born 1928. Now, how many students have had this poster on their wall right from the early 60s, mid-60s, right up until now? It's been on more students' walls than I've had hot dinners, and I've had quite a lot of hot dinners. He did some terrible things, this guy. I mean, he was in charge of prosecuting and executing people after the revolution in Cuba, and he didn't seem to mind too much about justice when it came to that. But he was really a poet and a poet warrior. Wrote a book about his motorbike travels around South America when he was younger. But I think he's gone into a caricature, hasn't he? It's this poster, really. It's not his politics or his speeches anymore, or even what he stood for exactly. It's this poster. It's this iconic poster. And we see him, it reminds me, some people have said it's a bit like Jesus or the Buddha or something, but I think it's more like I'm thinking of Philip of Macedon, Alexander the Great. That Greek way where you turn your hips one way, one leg slightly bent, one straight, one arm slightly bent, one straight. and your torso turns the other way to the hips, and then the head is slightly turned to one side and slightly looking up. And it's kind of looking into the mid-distance. It's a visionary's look. It's a dreamer's look. It's not a fanatic's look. He's not staring at you with these wild eyes, I believe in this and you must believe in that. No, it's this dreamer, this charismatic character. How much the berry adds to it, I'm not sure. The hair is part of it, that long, dark hair. But there you go. He has to be a part of modern iconography, and it's Che Guevara, number 6. Number 5, Jim Morrison, 1943. Jim Morrison he's a poet, isn't he? He's a poet, he's a warrior, he challenged standards, he used to get his trousers off on stage and there'd be loads of cops ready to pile on and arrest him. Why he had to do that, I don't know, but he's a real exhibitionist, and this pose where he's got his arms out like that is so Christ-like, isn't it? It's very much like the second coming, Jim Morrison. I don't know how much hubris he had, but in his words and in his performance and when he's talking, he's not coming across as some crazy straight down the line guy convinced. His poetry is very, very ambiguous. I don't really understand a lot of it, and some of it's very deep. He's talking about fucking his mother and killing his dad, or is it the other way around? Maybe it's the other way around. I don't know. So you got this pose that he's doing that's very Christ-like, and maybe that's not big-headed. Maybe it's just saying that's what it's like. You become this idol. You become idolized a bit like Christ, and it doesn't mean to say that you think you are, really think you are, but it kind of all destroyed him, didn't it, in the end? And he died in Paris. I can't remember why he died now, but I think it's got something to do with drinking. He was very overweight in his 30s, I think it was 30s, wasn't it? Or was he in the 27 club? I'm not sure, but he's there for all time. His poetry is absolutely wonderful, and I mean, the way the Doors set music to this was absolutely incredible, and so I think he's up there with these vulnerable yet passionately strong, iconic figures. So that's number 5, Jim Morrison. Number 4, Bob Marley. Bob Marley, born 1945. I mean, I could have chosen I wasn't looking for a black person. I just Bob Marley comes up in my mind sometimes for what he did and what he achieved and what he stood for. There could be someone like Malcolm X in this list, I guess, but again, it's this vulnerability, isn't it? I mean, the songs that Bob Marley sings are very much not about one race or one class. They're for everybody, aren't they? It's a real crossover. It's kind of political, but it's not political, is it? It's beyond politics, and his great bravery in trying to bring warring sides together in his own country, Jamaica, cost him a bullet, and his promotion of weed, of marijuana, was something that's really taken off, hasn't it? I mean, he was the first sort of mainstream guy that sort of got away with just being open about it. He didn't have to hide it. He was like, yeah, that's me. I love it. I think it's great. I think the world would be better if we're all smoking this shit. I think what he did was quite incredible. I thought the style of music, there were many other reggae artists, obviously, many of them, but he seemed to be the one that really broke through, and I kind of miss that kind of music these days, and that message of peace and harmony, and I know he was a very strong guy, but I see vulnerability in his lyrics and in his way of presenting himself. I think he deserves to be on this list, a great icon and still adored all around the world. So that's Number 4, Bob Marley. Number 3, David Bowie. Born 1947, South London boy. What can I say about David Bowie? I mean, David Bowie became almost like a god to many people. It's funny that he says in one of the quotes that he doesn't understand why people took him so seriously, which is quite a strange thing to say from someone who everyone was falling at his feet all over the world. I think really, I know he was a big fish and I couldn't really leave him out, but I left out Michael Jackson. He was a godlike to many people. I've left out John Lennon because I didn't see John Lennon as having that kind of vulnerability. He was too certain of things, too sure of things. Whereas Bowie was always changing his look, changing his style, changing his attitude, changing this, changing that. It was like someone said that he was very Nietzschean. He was like a Nietzschean reinventor of himself all the time. So I think he really deserves to be on this list as a great icon. And his androgyny, for example, his weakness or his vulnerability really on show in The Man Who Fell to Earth, the film. If you haven't seen it, it's just, he was a great actor as well, was David Bowie. But in that, he's this Martian guy, arrives on Earth, and he's so like thin. Would they call him the thin white Duke at times, didn't they? And he really is. He's so kind of, you feel like someone could blow at him and he'd just fall over. Like, you know, he was like a poke him and he'd shatter into pieces like a kind of a porcelain doll or something. And that's funny because he sang a song called China Doll, didn't he? But anyway, I don't think he meant it. But yeah, so that's David Bowie, and he's number 3. Number 2, here he comes. Can you hear him? He's on a motorbike. Hang on, it just gone by. Sid Vicious. Sid Vicious, born 1957. And here the romantic trajectory, the romantic tradition kind of arrives at a brick wall and crashes into it at 100 miles an hour. We started with Lord Byron back in the early 19th century, and we've gone through all these great characters that all had a lot of depth to them, and we arrive at a guy who's really nihilistic. He's wearing a Nazi t-shirt and he's just like crashing out all over the place. He doesn't have much to say. He's very good looking, obviously. He's very charismatic, like all these characters, extremely charismatic. But for some reason, this nihilist is still there today. He kind of brought a full stop or an exclamation mark to rock and roll, I think, although rock and roll carried on after Sid's death. And he really became a caricature of himself, and I think that's where the weakness, the vulnerability. I never met the guy. I saw him once in the Music Machine in Camden drinking with Nancy, but we didn't approach him. He was over there on that little balcony where there was a little bar hanging out. That's the only time I ever saw the guy, and he seemed to be like just hanging about like everybody else, and how much his reputation was just him living up to it. I've heard some of his old friends saying he did like a rumble every now and then, but no one seemed to think he was a really nasty kind of guy. And I see Sid as being a victim of himself. Yeah, a victim maybe of the pressure of the group and the manager and all the rest of it. But I do see him as being a really vulnerable character. He was playing up to his own cartoon character in a way, and and dying at the age of 21. I mean, he didn't even make the 27 club. I mean, it was a tragedy, and it kind of all ends there. For me, it all ends there. All the icons that go back to the romantic period, Sid's just pulled it all apart and thrown it all in the toilet, and it's all gone. For all intents and purposes, it's over. Although it staggers on for a while. It's not that long really before it really is all over. So that's the end of the dream, but it's only number 2, Sid Vicious. And so we get to number one, born in 1959. I thought a lot about this one, but I can't help myself. It's Morrissey. Morrissey. If Morrissey and Lord Byron, I can see great similarities. I think if either of them were born at the other one's body, at the other one, in the other one's time, if that would be possible, that'd be an interesting film. They might have been very, very similar characters. I think Morrissey is a fantastic poet. I think if he has to do music because that's what poets do now. They do music, although a lot of it's shit, but not Morrissey's work. And I wasn't a big fan of the Smiths. I saw them once only. I think that must have been 84, 85. They did a miners. The miners were on strike in those days, if you remember, and they did a benefit gig. It was the GLC, the Greater London Council. I've forgotten his name now, who ran it now, Ken something, I've forgotten his, Red Ken I'll call him, shall I? And there was a county hall on the south bank of the River Thames, and there was a big gig there, and they headlined it, and I saw it, and there were flowers flying around, and I didn't see them really until they were on Top of the Pops, with this string of hits that they had, and I was kind of, this is a strange look. Is it like the New Romantics were dominating in that time, and they didn't really look like a New Romantic after a long night out and too many downers, as I've said 3 times in 3 videos now. I keep using that variations on that line. He didn't really look like that, and it then kind of just faded away from me. I had friends that really liked him, and he sort of had this cult around him. I didn't take much notice until You Are the Quarry came out in the early 2000s, and I really think that's a brilliant album. I mean, it's an absolutely fantastic album, and I was listening to it again last night, and the poetry in that is amazing, and I played some of the old Smiths songs as well, and thinking, wow, so the honesty in his lyrics. There's more honesty and down-to-earthness in Morrissey's lyrics than in most punk bands, like the Sex Pistols, who were being like, jazzing up honesty, to make a bit of a show and to make it like seem more than it really was. Whereas Morrissey's sort of, it's down-to-earth, but it's very extreme, but down to earth at the same time, and I'm not one to really be able to analyse these things in a very, very deep way. He's also vulnerable. It comes out in his lyrics, and I know he has a difficult relationship with the media and the press, but I really see a great vulnerability in him, as well as a really great strength. You can't write lyrics like that if you don't have another side to your character. So I think that kind of saves things, really, because after Sid comes in, it's kind of all over, really, and then you get a character like Morrissey comes out. Another figure I could have said was Nick Cave, although he's never achieved maybe as highly as Morrissey has with hits, but there are characters like this have really saved us, I think. And so there you go. Well, that's my top 14 iconic legends, whatever you want to call them, that have shaped the culture and whatever. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thanks for listening, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you about.